Silas Harper hadn't set foot in the cabin for more than 20 years, yet the moment the gravel road gave way to the soft curve of pine-lined dirt, something familiar gripped his chest. The trees were taller now, their branches reaching across the narrow road like aging sentinels that remembered him, even if he'd forgotten them. The silence was deeper than he remembered, not peaceful, but dense, like an unwelcome stillness that had taken root in his absence. It was early afternoon when he arrived, and the air smelled of moss and sap, the kind of sharp clarity that only came from a place untouched for too long. He parked his car where he always used to, just beside the bend in the trail where the birch tree still leaned slightly to the right. But before he could turn off the engine, his eyes caught something out of place. A sign. It stood firm at the edge of the clearing, bright and polished, bolted into the earth with intention. Ridgeline Guest Cabin. Bookings available online, it read, followed by a QR code and a local area code phone number. At first, Silas thought he'd driven too far, that maybe he'd passed the family property and stumbled onto some modern retreat in the woods. But the large boulder near the porch, the wraparound deck his mother had painted that odd shade of blue, those were unmistakable. This was the cabin. His cabin. Confused, he stepped out of the car and approached the building. The wood had been refinished recently, perhaps within the last year. The windows were spotless, framed with white shutters that definitely hadn't been there when he was a boy. And there were flower boxes, actual flower boxes, beneath the front windows, overflowing with red and white begonias. The entire place looked staged, curated for a travel brochure, and the longer he stood in the gravel, the more surreal it became. Then the door opened. A man stepped onto the porch, maybe in his late 30s, dressed in hiking gear and holding a folded paper map. He looked startled to see Silas, though not hostile, just confused. "You here for the weekend too?" he asked, gesturing with a smile. "They said they overbooked, but I thought we had the place to ourselves." Silas could only stare at him. He managed to ask stiffly what he meant. The man explained, laughing lightly, that he and his partner had booked the place through a site that specialized in unique cabin stays, remote, unplugged getaways. Ridgeline was the highest-rated listing in the county, the man added before disappearing back inside. Silas didn't follow. He walked slowly back toward his car, struggling to make sense of what he'd just seen. There had to be a mistake. No one had permission to use the property, much less renovate it. The deed was in his name, untouched since his mother's passing. The cabin was never meant to be a business or a tourist stop. It had always been personal, a sanctuary passed down through generations. But something had changed. That much was clear. He turned back toward the woods, his thoughts racing. Who had done this? And, more importantly, how long had it been happening? Silas returned the next morning with the uneasy determination of someone who hoped that daylight would bring clarity, and perhaps that what he had seen the previous day would reveal itself as a misunderstanding, born of exhaustion and faulty memory. But when he turned into the clearing, the cabin looked even less like the place he remembered, and more like an advertisement for rustic luxury. The flowers on the porch seemed freshly watered. A narrow gravel path had been edged with decorative stones. Leading from the driveway to the steps, and the sign at the entrance still gleamed in the sun as though it had been placed there only hours earlier, and for a long moment he simply sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, wondering how it was. Possible that something so private had been transformed without his consent into a commodity, a rental, a product. He finally forced himself out of the vehicle, determined to reclaim his ground, but before he could even approach the porch, the door swung open again, and this time it was not the hiker from yesterday, but a woman in her 40s, neatly dressed in a light summer blouse and khaki trousers, who carried herself with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to welcoming guests. She smiled as though she had been expecting him, though there was a flicker of calculation behind her eyes, and in a voice that was both warm and oddly patronizing, she said, "You must be lost. This is the Ridgeline Guest Cabin. The hosts handle check-ins at the general store in town." Silas, taken aback, tried to explain that the cabin was his, that it had been in his family for decades, that he knew every corner of it because it had been the center of his childhood. Summers, but the woman simply tilted her head, as if listening to someone describing a dream, and then, with a patient smile, informed him that there must be a confusion, because the Ridgeline property had belonged to the Sorrel family for as long as anyone could remember, and she herself, Melinda Sorrel, was the one managing it as a guest retreat. Silas's protests fell flat against her calm assertions, and the more insistently he spoke, the more her expression shifted into one of polite pity, the kind one might reserve for a person rambling incoherently, until finally she suggested, in a tone that cut through the stillness of the trees with a hint of finality, that he should perhaps check the county records if he truly believed otherwise. She then closed the door gently but firmly, leaving him standing on the gravel with the distinct sensation that the ground beneath his feet no longer belonged to him. He drove into town, the knot in his stomach tightening with each mile, and stopped at the county clerk's office, where the stale smell of paper and dust offered the only sense of familiarity he had felt all day. He requested the property file, expecting the relief of seeing his name printed clearly on the deed, but when the clerk returned with the folder and placed it on the counter, his heart sank. The documents showed the owner listed as Melinda Sorrel, with a transfer of title recorded only 18 months earlier. He argued with the clerk, insisting there must be an error, but the clerk merely shrugged and said that the paperwork was in order, the signatures notarized, the transfer properly filed, and that if he wished to dispute it, he would need to hire legal counsel. Silas stared at the records, feeling as if he were looking at a parallel version of reality in which his entire past had been neatly erased. The situation might have ended there, with him retreating in confusion, had he not run into the couple from the previous night while leaving the building. They recognized him and asked casually if he was checking in later, because they had loved their short stay but had to cut it short due to a sudden work emergency. And they mentioned in passing how welcoming the host, Ms. Sorrel, had been, how she told them the cabin had always been in her family, and how she even shared stories about her childhood there. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the breeze coming off the mountains. Those stories could only have been his own, about the birch tree by the bend, the nights spent listening to the forest settle, the deck his mother painted, details he had never shared beyond his family. Hearing them casually repeated by strangers as though they belonged to someone else made him feel hollow, like he was disappearing from his own history. He tried to confront Melinda again that evening, returning to the cabin as the light dimmed, but she greeted him on the porch not with hostility, but with a weary sort of indulgence, telling him that he looked unwell, that perhaps he had mistaken memories from childhood, and that the mind sometimes confuses what belonged to whom after so many years. When he pushed harder, demanding to know how she had entered, how she had changed the locks, and why she was fabricating ownership, her smile vanished, and with a sudden coolness she told him he was no longer welcome to linger around her property. And if he returned again without reservation, she would consider it trespassing and involve the sheriff. Then she shut the door once more, and this time Silas could hear the heavy slide of the new deadbolt locking into place. Standing there in the twilight, listening to the muffled laughter of unseen guests inside what should have been his private refuge, Silas understood that this was no simple confusion. The cabin had been absorbed into another story, rewritten as if it had never been his, and Melinda was not merely lying but establishing a new version of reality, one that was already accepted by the townspeople, the records, and even casual visitors. The weight of that realization settled on him like a physical force, and as he walked back to his car, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes, he knew that what had been taken from him was more than property. It was his history, his place in the world, and if he did nothing, it would soon be as though he had never belonged there at all. Silas did not sleep the night after being turned away from the cabin, and when the thin light of dawn reached the small window of the motel where he had taken a room, he already knew that nothing would be solved by waiting passively for sense to return, So he drove back to the town's administrative office, determined to push further than he had before, and demanded to see the historical property archives rather than the single folder that had been handed to him the previous day. The clerk, annoyed by his persistence, reluctantly led him to the back room where cabinets stood in neat rows, their drawers labeled with parcel numbers and dates, and for an hour he sifted through brittle papers and fading microfilm reels until he found a record from the 70s showing the cabin deed under the Harper name. That much was expected, but what struck him was the sudden absence of continuity. There were decades of tax receipts and minor notations about structural repairs until roughly 12 years ago, when the entries stopped as if someone had closed a book. Mid-sentence. After that, the file jumped abruptly to the transfer to Melinda Sorrell. Nothing in between, no clear bridge connecting the past to the present, and Silas felt a cold unease because the silence of those missing years was more terrifying than any outright fabrication. Later, when he carried copies of those earlier deeds into the sheriff's office, hoping that someone with authority might recognize the strangeness, he was met with a polite but unmistakably guarded response. The sheriff, a broad man with an expression that suggested he had long ago stopped listening closely to the complaints of strangers, studied the documents without real interest, and remarked that people misplace ownership records all the time, that old family cabins changed hands quietly when heirs moved away, and that if Harper really wished to contest it, the county court was the only path. But, beneath that veneer of procedure, Silas caught a flicker in the man's eyes, a hesitation so small it might have been imagined, as though the sheriff knew more about Melinda's claim than he was willing to say. When Silas pressed him, asking whether he truly believed a family could lose its property without notice, whether he had ever seen Melinda living there as a child, the sheriff's voice cooled, and he suggested firmly that Silas should let go of the matter before it turned into harassment. The word hung between them like a threat, not shouted, not even spoken with hostility, but heavy with implication. The more he pushed, the more he risked being recast as the intruder. It was then that Silas understood the scale of the problem, for it was not merely that a neighbor had overstepped boundaries, nor that bureaucratic error had rearranged his inheritance. It was that the community itself had absorbed the rewritten narrative and now reinforced it at every turn. At the diner where he stopped for coffee, he overheard two locals discussing weekend bookings at the Sorrel Lodge, with the same casual familiarity one might use to describe a landmark that had existed for generations. When he asked one of them, tentatively, if they remembered the Harpers ever owning property in the area, the man looked at him blankly and said, "Never heard of them," before turning back to his meal. It was not a lie spoken with malice, but the kind of unshakable certainty that comes from repeating a truth so often it no longer requires thought. Silas felt as though he were the last person alive who remembered his own history, and that realization gnawed at him more than Melinda's hostility, for it meant that he could be erased not through violence or theft, but through collective acceptance of a new story. Compelled by that fear, he returned to the cabin late that night, when the town had gone quiet and the road was empty of headlights. He left his car down the slope and walked the final stretch through the trees, guided only by memory and the faint glimmer of the porch lights ahead. The cabin was alive with voices and music, guests laughing as if celebrating in a place that had never belonged to him. He did not approach the front. Instead, he circled through the woods to where the old cellar entrance had once been hidden behind a tangle of shrubs. To his astonishment, the shrubs had been cut back, the entrance reinforced with a new wooden hatch, but the latch was simple, and after some effort he pried it open and slipped inside. The cellar smelled of cedar and detergent, no longer the dusty, forgotten chamber of his childhood. Racks of neatly folded linens lined the walls, plastic bins full of supplies stacked on wooden pallets, and a faint hum of a dehumidifier echoed in the corner. It was the storage space of a functioning business, carefully maintained, yet in one shadowed corner he spotted something untouched. A box, weathered and collapsed, half buried under old boards. Inside were fragments of the past, an enamel mug with his mother's initials scratched into the bottom, a child's drawing of the birch tree, and a rusted key with the family's tag still attached. He held these objects in his hands, feeling both vindicated and crushed, proof of his history locked inside a building that no longer acknowledged him. As he left the cellar and retreated back into the woods, Silas caught sight of the movement on the porch. Melinda herself had stepped outside, her figure silhouetted against the glow of the interior, and for a long moment she simply stood there, as if sensing the disturbance, before turning her head directly toward the trees where he crouched. Though he was sure she could not see him clearly, the tilt of her posture and the slow smile that spread across her face filled him with the unnerving certainty that she knew he was watching, that she wanted him to know she knew. Then she called softly into the night, not to him but as if to the darkness itself. "Everything is as it should be," before turning back inside. The words echoed in Silas's ears as he withdrew, each step heavier than the last. He understood then that he was not merely confronting a fraudulent claim to property, but something far larger, a narrative so carefully constructed that every authority, every neighbor, and every stranger already upheld it. And the deeper he pushed against it, the more it seemed to twist around him, threatening to brand him the outsider, the trespasser, the one who did not belong. Silas spent the next day tracing the town's edges like a cartographer of his own doubt, following old routes he remembered from childhood that had no reason to change because the hills had not shifted, and the creek still braided itself under the fallen hemlock, yet each familiar landmark felt slightly repurposed, as though someone had moved the furniture of a life while he was gone, and then insisted nothing had been touched, and by late afternoon his drifting brought him to the general store, whose porch had always smelled of coffee and motor oil, where a bulletin board leaned near the entrance under a film of thumbtack rust and curling flyers for yard sales, lost dogs, and the farmer's market, tucked among them as if it had always been. There, a laminated card announced Ridgeline Quiet Weekends, community-supported maintenance of a historic cabin, followed by a line that snagged his breath because it named the site the Old Harper Place, not with malice but with the bland certainty of a settled fact, as if the town had not stolen anything but had adopted a stray and given it a respectable collar. He stood staring at the words long enough that the woman at the counter asked if he needed help, and because there was nothing else to do, he asked for a copy of the maintenance schedule, hearing himself adopt the speech of someone who belonged, and she reached beneath the register for a spiral-bound ledger whose pages were smudged with graphite, squares of dates filled with initials that repeated like a refrain, M, S, S, C, B, B, the same hands signing up for supply runs, septic checks, snow, shoveling, and porch repairs, and in the margin beside several spring weekends a neat list of donations, small amounts that together would buy paint and bedding, with names that traced a web across the county, deputy, clerk, school board chair, so that what had felt like Melinda's personal theft now revealed itself as a town-sized arrangement with its own quiet logic. He asked where the quiet weekends came from, why they existed at all, and the woman told him in the conversational tone of someone narrating local trivia that the program had been running for years, born out of a grief group that needed a place to breathe without televisions or traffic, a place where arrival did not require explanations, and that Melinda had stepped in to coordinate after the previous caretaker moved away. And at the word caretaker, Silas felt a small internal lurch because it reframed the cabin not as property but as obligation, a story in which absence was an invitation and stewardship filled the vacuum left by a family that let go. He thanked her and walked out with the ledger's ghost pressed into his mind, the repeated initials like footprints through wet grass. He did not want to believe that his mother's house had slid so easily into a communal narrative, but the evidence of participation was too ordinary to dismiss, and the ordinariness frightened him more than any dramatic betrayal because it meant he had lost to habit rather than to force. At dusk, he returned to the ridge by the service road locals used for firewood and snowmobiles, a corridor of utility more than beauty, and from there he approached the cabin by its unphotographed side, the one that faced the brush pile and the moss-slick cistern. The deck lights were off, the meadow dim, the air full of those small sounds that announce the woods are settling into themselves, and for a while he stood in the muted light trying to decide whether to knock, to plead, to assert, or simply to occupy space until someone asked him to leave. But the indecision dissolved when he noticed a thin line etched into the siding near the back door, a seam where fresh board met old. Beneath the newer paint, ghost marks showed the yearly pencil lines where his height had been measured against the jamb, faint as veins under skin, initials SH, and dates that belonged to summers that smelled of blueberries and kerosene lamp wicks. The discovery left him practically winded, a proof not. Made of paper, but of the body once contained by this place, and he ran a thumb over the shallow grooves until the skin warmed the wood, as if heat could coax the past into legibility. He might have stayed there until the dark erased everything, but the door opened, not abruptly or with the theatricality of a confrontation, simply with the composed inevitability of someone finishing a task and stepping into evening, and Melinda stood a few feet away holding a towel that smelled of starch and pine, her expression unreadable, neither pleased nor surprised, as though she had expected him to find that seam sooner or later. She said his name softly, not as a question, and asked if he would walk with her to the well, because the pulley had begun to squeal again, and she wanted to show him the way the rope wore down when guests used it wrong. The request was domestic. Almost courteous and against his better judgment, he followed, the two of them moving along the path in a hush broken only by crickets. And there, at the circular stone ring, she began to speak in a tone that resembled honesty, even if it was only practice, telling him that years ago, she would not specify how many, his mother had sat on this very stone and confessed that she could no longer keep up with the place, that the roof would go and the taxes would follow, and that what hurt most was not the expense, but the silence of a house unvisited, the furniture aging slower than the people who remembered it. Melinda said she offered to keep the path swept and the pipes running in exchange for the occasional use by groups that needed quiet, and that nothing was taken and nothing given, only a staving off of rot, a pact that sounded temporary until time piled on top of it like leaves. Silas wanted to reject the scene as fiction, to insist his mother would never have asked a neighbor to tend what she was determined to pass down intact, yet the image of her sitting at the well, palms reddened by rope, felt too plausible to dismiss, and he recognized in himself that dangerous human weakness for any story that knits a clean beginning to a painful present. He asked why the town's name was all over the ledger, but his own had been erased from conversation. And Melinda answered without triumph that communities remember what is available to them and forget what is not, that a place lived in by many will anchor itself more deeply than a place idolized in absence, and that the stories she told visitors about the birch, the blue deck, the summer storms, were not theft, but scaffolding, a way to teach newcomers how to behave in a house with a past. And if. She sometimes used his mother's phrases word for word. It was because those words did the work required to keep the quiet intact. The admission landed like a bruise, tender in its strange respect, and he realized the midpoint of his struggle had nothing to do with proving ownership. He could not shove the town back into a version of memory it no longer shared, and everything to do with presence, with whether he would take up space in his own story or let the choreography continue without him. When they returned to the porch, she handed him the towel as if to mark a truce and said there would be a silent arrival later, a pair from 3 counties over who came every equinox, and she asked him not to disturb them because the rule of the house was that talk belonged to the woods and not to the threshold. Something in the formulation irritated him, the way it sounded like scripture dressed in hospitality, and before he could swallow the feeling, he asked her what she was guarding so fiercely that required the town's complicity and his erasure, and for the first time she looked tired, not performatively weary but older, as though the role she played had a cost that arithmetic could not show, and she said that what she guarded was simple: continuity, the staving off of collapse, the refusal to let every tender thing die the moment its named owner drives away. She told him to stay if he wished, to stand off the path and watch how people entered when they knew they would not be asked for explanations. And though the invitation was a test, it was also a door, and he took it because he needed to know whether the quiet Melinda curated was a mask for something cruel or a rough shelter built out of local weather and stubbornness. He stood in the shadow of the birch until the car arrived, headlights dimmed, and watched the couple step out with the care of those who have learned to move gently because the world will not handle them that way, and he expected some ritual, some coded phrase or exchange of objects, but there was only the measured removing of shoes on the porch and the long exhale a person makes when a burden is briefly set down, and when the door closed, the woods felt larger, not smaller, as if the silence had expanded to include him. In that expansion lay the pivot he had not anticipated. This was not a theft conducted by villains, but a succession performed by neighbors who had decided that use was more sacred than title, and the path forward would not be a courtroom or a headline. It would be a choice about where to stand when the town decided what to remember. Silas left the cabin that night with the towel still in his hand, the smell of starch clinging to his palm, and though Melinda's words had been spoken calmly, even reasonably, he felt the weight of something far more deliberate pressing down on him. For the quiet she claimed to preserve was not passive, but constructed, and once you understood that it was constructed, you realized it could be weaponized. The following days deepened that suspicion, because wherever he went in town, the conversation bent toward her narrative. At the post office, an elderly man asked if he was the cousin helping Melinda with repairs. At the diner, the waitress asked whether he was staying long at the guest house, and in each case their tone was not hostile but unquestioning, and that unquestioning quality hurt more than any open rejection, because it confirmed how completely his identity had been folded out of the local story. The shift from discomfort to menace came subtly. On the third morning, he returned to the motel to find his reservation terminated without warning, the desk clerk apologizing with visible discomfort as she explained that his payment information had failed authorization, though he knew his accounts were intact. When he tried to call the bank, his phone no longer connected. When he borrowed a payphone in town, the line went dead the moment he recited his card number. By evening, his debit card itself had been declined at the only grocery in town. He felt as if his life had been switched on to someone else's circuit board and unplugged, and the absence of anger from the people relaying these denials made it worse, because they acted like they were just following ordinary procedure, as though the erasure of his access to money, shelter, and identity was a natural occurrence. Frustrated, he walked back toward the ridge at dusk, taking the longer trail through the woods, and when he reached the cabin, he saw that changes had already been made. The old rocking chair that had belonged to his mother was gone from the porch, replaced by a sleek Adirondack set in dark green paint. Through the window he glimpsed the fireplace where they had once roasted marshmallows, but the stone mantel had been covered by a polished wooden facade, and the familiar discolorations of smoke and age had been sanded away. Each alteration was more violent than any broken window could have been, because it struck directly at the continuity of memory, stripping away evidence that he had ever belonged there. Driven by a mix of grief and rage, Silas returned at night and entered through the cellar again, though the hatch had been reinforced with a new lock, which he pried loose with a crowbar borrowed from an abandoned shed. Inside, he found the space reorganized yet again. The bins had been labeled with laminated cards, the linens vacuum-sealed in plastic, the tools arranged in a precision that felt more like a laboratory than a home. But behind a stack of storage tubs he noticed the wall itself had been modified, fresh insulation stuffed into a cavity where he remembered old shelves. Tearing it back, he discovered a narrow chamber he had never seen before, filled with documents. Guest logs signed under pseudonyms, envelopes of cash payments, and slips of paper bearing strange annotations in Melinda's neat hand, such as voices. Calmed and threshold respected. The words sent a shiver through him not because of what they said, but because of how clearly they pointed to rules he had never heard, a private grammar of conduct applied to his own house without his consent. The discovery should have been his victory, a piece of leverage against her. Yet when he emerged into the night with the papers clutched against his chest, he found himself blinded by headlights from a truck parked at the tree line. Two men stepped out, both unfamiliar, both wearing plain clothes but moving with a professional ease that marked them as something other than neighbors. One of them spoke without raising his voice. "You're trespassing on a managed property. Best leave those where you found them." Silas tried to argue, but the man only repeated the phrase, his tone unwavering until Silas realized that whatever words he might use, they had already been anticipated, neutralized, and filed away. He retreated, clutching the documents tighter, but by the time he returned to town, the motel clerk told him his belongings had been removed and stored for convenience, as if he had checked out voluntarily. The following evening, he attempted to show the logs to the one man in town who had seemed to remember him, the old bartender, but the bar was shuttered, the windows dark, and a paper notice taped to the door read, "Closed until further notice." No explanation, no date of return. He stood on the deserted street feeling the full machinery of exclusion settle around him, not through violence, but through absence. A removal of options until the only path remaining was the one they had prepared. And when he returned once more to the ridge, the cabin lights glowing warm and steady, Melinda was waiting on the porch as if she had been expecting him, and her smile was almost tender when she said, "It's not about keeping you out, Silas. It's about teaching you the rules you forgot." In that moment, beneath the weight of the logs in his arms and the implacable certainty in her voice, Silas understood that escalation had already occurred, and that what was at stake was no longer simply a building or a deed, but the right to define what the truth of a place would be, and who had the authority to live inside it. The night that Silas decided he would no longer circle the edges but step directly into the center of whatever had taken root inside the cabin was one of those autumn evenings when the air seemed to carry more silence than sound, when even the animals held back as though the forest itself anticipated an intrusion, and he walked up the gravel path not with stealth but with the deliberate pace of someone who knew he had already been expected. The porch light burned steadily, throwing a yellow halo against the dark wood, and when he pushed open the gate he noticed for the first time that the flowers in the boxes were not decorative but uniform, identical white blooms arranged with unnatural symmetry, as if the house were not meant to welcome but to signal, a flag to anyone who understood the code. He climbed the steps and did not knock. Instead, he pressed his hand against the door and it opened with a weightless ease, revealing the interior transformed once more. The living room, where he remembered sagging couches and the scratchy plaid blanket his mother favored, was now stripped of personality, furnished with simple wooden benches arranged in 2 long rows facing the hearth, and on the hearth itself, above the fire that crackled too evenly to be real, hung a board inscribed with lines that looked at first like poetry, but revealed themselves, when read carefully, to be instructions. Do not speak before the 3rd hour. Do not cross the threshold without welcome. Do not name what you see. The guests sat quietly on the benches, a dozen of them, men and women of varying ages, dressed not in robes or uniforms but in ordinary clothing, their faces strangely serene, as though they had already rehearsed their roles. At the far end, Melinda stood, her posture composed, her hands folded at her waist, and when she saw Silas she did not look surprised or even disturbed, only faintly relieved, as if a long-delayed arrival had finally taken place. She addressed the room without raising her voice, explaining that the house had always needed a guardian, that the woods required Silence to be held intact, and that his absence had created a vacancy others had been forced to fill. Her words were spoken like a benediction, but each one cut him with the weight of appropriation, because she was narrating his own inheritance as if it were a communal duty passed to the most willing, and the guests nodded gently, confirming her story, with the rhythm of belief. Silas tried to protest, raising the papers he had stolen from the cellar, but Melinda only glanced at them with a mixture of pity and fatigue, saying that documents were fragile things. They burned, they dissolved, while rules, etched into practice, endured. The crowd did not jeer or shout. They simply absorbed her tone and turned their eyes toward him, not hostile but heavy, the weight of collective certainty pressing down on his solitary defiance. And then the sound came. It was faint at first, a low resonance that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards rather than from any instrument, a vibration that made the glass panes hum and the benches tremble slightly. The guests closed their eyes as if on cue, and Melinda whispered that this was the hour when the house decided whether someone belonged, when silence became either shield or sentence. Silas felt the vibration enter his chest, unsettling, almost unbearable. And in that moment he realized that the cabin was no longer merely a place but had been converted into an engine of memory, a machine for enforcing belonging, and if he submitted to the rhythm, he would be absorbed into the same calm obedience he saw in the others. He stepped backward toward the door, but two of the guests had already risen without malice, simply positioning themselves between him and escape, their eyes still half closed as if they were following choreography. The choice crystallized: remain and be rewritten into their version of the story, or shatter the performance entirely. Silas raised his voice, breaking the unspoken rule of silence, and the words came not as argument but as invocation. A torrent of memories shouted into the ordered stillness. His mother's laughter when rain drummed on the tin roof. The way the birch outside leaned against storms. The carved marks of his growth scratched into the doorframe. Each sentence was jagged, unpolished, yet the sound of them fractured the rhythm, the hum faltering as if the house itself recoiled. The guests stirred uneasily, their calm disrupted, and for the first time Melinda's composure cracked. She shouted over him, insisting that order had to be preserved, that his memories were dangerous because they reminded the house of its unfinished owner. The fire flared as if fueled by their conflict, shadows leaping across the walls, and Silas seized the moment to tear the inscribed board from above the hearth, splintering it across the stones. The act was clumsy, brutal, but it broke the fragile architecture of authority, the guests rising in confusion, their serenity splintered into fear and disorientation. Melinda cried out, her voice raw now, no longer calm, demanding that they remember the rules, but they were already faltering, muttering to themselves, questioning what had just happened. Silas, his throat raw, stood amid the wreckage of the board and shouted only once more, "This is my house," the words echoing with a force that seemed to belong not to him alone, but to every trace of memory still embedded in the beams, the grooves, the hidden corners of the place. And in that moment, with the silence broken and the ritual undone, the hum died completely, leaving only the ordinary crackle of fire and the heavy breathing of a dozen unsettled strangers. The climax had not come with violence, but with disruption, the collapse of a script that had seemed unshakable until one person insisted on a different story, and as the guests filed out in confusion, leaving Melinda standing alone before the broken hearth. Silas felt both triumphant and terrified, because though he had reclaimed his house in that instant, he also knew the war was not with her alone, but with the entire structure of belief she had cultivated, and belief, once rooted, does not die with a single night's defiance. When the last of the guests drifted down the gravel path and their silhouettes dissolved into the trees, a stillness settled over the cabin that was different from the curated silence Melinda had enforced, not orderly or ceremonial, but raw, uneven, pierced by the ordinary sounds of insects returning to the night and the faint shifting of wind along the roofline. Silas stood in the middle of the room, breathing the air that smelled of ash and splintered wood, and for the first time since his arrival he felt the space respond not to a script, but to his presence, as though the memory of his family had risen. Through the cracks he had opened, Melinda remained by the hearth, her face pale, her posture sagging without the scaffolding of collective agreement, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the practiced authority, only a weary defiance, telling him that he had broken. Something that could never be repaired, that the town would not forgive the disruption, that they would erase him entirely now if they had to. Silas listened, but the threat no longer held power, because he had seen the guests falter, had seen belief collapse in real time, and he knew the performance could not simply be stitched back together. He gathered the fragments of the board, the jagged pieces still bearing half-legible words, and carried them outside to the porch, scattering them across the damp soil where the rain would rot the wood into nothing. The cabin looked strange in the moonlight, still altered, its furniture foreign, its walls repainted, but beneath those changes the bones were unchanged. The same beams his mother had dusted, the same porch posts where he had leaned as a boy, and he understood then that reclamation would not be about restoring an image but about inhabiting the structure again, letting his presence carve new grooves into it until the usurpation faded like a stain left in sunlight. He did not expect the town to welcome him, nor did he expect Melinda to surrender quietly, but he no longer needed their permission, because the place had recognized him when he shouted his memories aloud, and that recognition was stronger than any ledger or bylaw. As dawn broke, he sat on the steps with the first light striking the birch tree, the smell of wet earth rising around him, and he allowed himself the fragile belief that the cabin could once again belong to him, not through possession alone, but through endurance, through refusing to be erased. The silence that followed was no longer enforced. It was simply the forest breathing, and in that breath he found the beginning of peace, knowing that while the struggle with the town would continue, the house itself was already his.